The List by Patricia Forde, Chapter 10. Number 351. Question. What you ask needs answer. The hour before the dawn was dark and unpromising, Letta thought, looking out of her bedroom window. Her thoughts were racing. Questions had kept her awake through the long night. Who had dropped the card there? And most pressing of all, was it true? Could Benjamin be alive? She tried to suppress the excitement she felt. Please let it be true. Let him be alive. Another part of her brain shouted even louder, calling her a fool. John Noah had told her that Benjamin was dead. He wouldn't have said it if it weren't true. But what if the scavenger had lied to him? On the street below there was no sound. The full moon was hidden behind the brooding clouds, and the morning electricity hadn't yet kicked in. Letta looked in the note in her hand, the red ink on the white page. Need help. Letta. 3 words, 2 lists, and a name, and yet it had taken her half the night to compose the message. She had spent hours debating whether or not she should sign her name. If the note fell into the wrong hands, there would be no escape. But if she didn't sign her name, how could they know it was her? She was beyond caring. She would leave the message under the stone just as she had written it. Hugo had said to leave it there before dawn. She blew out the candle beside her bed and got dressed in the gray light. She walked through the quiet town as though in a dream, trying not to think about the danger, trying not to think about her thirst, which was now a raging beast. The moon had come back out and lit her path, and she was grateful for it. She headed toward the west gate, turning right before she came to it, and climbed up the steep hill to the goddess. As she walked, she could hear the whir of the tumbling windmills at the top of the hill. They were there from the time before the melting, when John Noah had started to prepare for the disaster he saw coming. Now they provided power to Ark, about the only technology they had. Of course, power was strictly rationed. It would come on just after dawn for 3 hours, and again in the evening for 2 hours during the winter months. This was when Central Kitchen cooked the food and other essential services were carried out. Only John Noah and the Green Warriors had power all day, as befitted their standing. Letta trudged on. She could see the shapes of the goddess silhouetted against the sky. She was almost upon the statue when she realized there was someone there. Letta stopped. She could hear a voice. She crouched there for a moment, totally still. A female voice. But who would be up here at this hour? A gaver? There were some female gavers. She had to get closer. She crept along the path, the dry stalks of grass scratching her bare legs. She could make out the words now. Goddess, please! Daniel is a good boy. Please! Letta peered at her as the early morning sun climbed into the sky, momentarily blinding her. It was the healer's wife, Rose, kneeling in front of the statue and rocking over and back, keening softly. Letta stayed there, transfixed. The wind was starting to build, and the noise of the windmills was getting stronger. Letta edged forward. Rose! She tried to keep her voice low so as not to startle the woman, but she got no reaction. The keening continued, interspersed with the odd word. Please, not for me, for Daniel. Letta came out of the long grass and stood on the path within 3 strides of Rose, but it was clear that the other woman was too far gone to even notice. Very gently, Letta walked up to her and touched her shoulder. The face that turned and confronted her was alive with naked fear. Rose opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. It's all right, Rose, Letta said. Me, Letta, no harm. Rose's eyes opened wide, and she stood immobile, looking at Letta. Letta stroked the older woman's arm and whispered reassurance to her until finally the hunted look left her eyes and large tears rolled down her face. You poor thing, Letta said. You miss your boy. The woman nodded, and Letta could see she was unable to speak. There might be someone, Letta said. The woman stared at her uncomprehending. Letta took her arm. Listen, she said, I'm going to ask someone if they could help you. The woman collapsed into Letta's arms, great sobs racking her body. Letta held her, feeling the warm tears through the thin fabric on her shoulder. Letta looked up. How? She said, Rose looked up. How? She said, searching Letta's face, as though she could find the answers there. Letta put her finger on the woman's lips. Shh, she said. Go home now. Wait. The woman nodded, then turned and fell on her knees before the goddess. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Then she got up and headed down the hill. Her stomach in a knot, Letta watched her go. Why had she promised to help Rose? She couldn't even help herself, and yet she couldn't bear to see her pain and say nothing. If there was any chance, didn't she deserve hope? But still, feelings of guilt lay heavily on Letta. What if the desecrators couldn't help? Or wouldn't help? She went behind the statue and found a big flat stone. She lifted it at one corner and shoved the note underneath. Now all she could do was wait. Before she left, she stood in front of the goddess and looked into her cold, empty eyes. How wonderful to believe there was a power greater than yourself, someone who could sort things out for you. I'm sorry, goddess, she said aloud. I don't think I can believe in you. She took a deep breath. The air already had a hint of winter in it, sharp and cold. Beneath her, under the weak rays of the new sunrise, the town sprawled, guileless, an infant waking up to a new day. The weak electric lights came on, strung like stars across the landscape. Letta hurried down the rough path, noticing dark clouds scurrying across the sky and joining the broody bank that had already settled over Tin Town. Below her, the fields were orange in the early morning light, with a gentle breeze rifling through them. Her stomach grumbled, and she quickened her step, making her way to the line that had already started outside Central Kitchen. Her tongue cleaved to the roof of her mouth with thirst. As soon as she walked in, she could smell apples and was rewarded with a glass of juice alongside her piece of bread and 2 eggs. Mary Pepper handed her. She drank the juice before moving out of the line. The cold, bitter liquid drenched her tongue. She held it in her mouth for a moment before swallowing. Mary Pepper glared at her. Go, she said, but for once Letta didn't care. Her thirst had been abated, and soon she would be able to go to the water station for her allowance. Her thoughts went back to the goddess and Rose's behavior in front of the statue. Praying. That's what Benjamin called it. Was it any worse than leaving her note? Who was to say Hugo had told her the truth? Even if he had and Marlowe's friends got the note, why should they trust her? By the time she got back to the shop, her head ached and she couldn't think clearly anymore. When the bells rang for the 11th hour, the door opened and Mrs. Truckle came in. Letta knew the old woman was keeping an eye on her. She knew her old teacher would not let Benjamin be disgraced. She should be grateful for that. Mrs. Truckle, Letta said, giving no hint of the way she was thinking. No harm. Mrs. Truckle smiled. Where ink, she said, her bright eyes darting around the room as if Letta might have hidden it there. Oh, no, Letta forgot. She had totally forgotten about it. Nearly ready, she said, hoping the teacher hadn't noticed her alarm. Many bottles? 20, Mrs. Truckle said, and Letta's heart sank. She had better tell the truth. Not filled yet, she said, trying to apologize, though through the tone of her voice. There was no word for sorry on the list. Mrs. Truckle shrugged. Come, she said, I help. Before Letta could say anything, the small woman had gone through to the living room and was standing over the bowl full of ink. She tutted to herself as she removed the wire strainer with its mashed-up beetroot and peered into the bowl. Good color, she muttered, and Letta rushed to get the small bottles they used for the ink. She handed the bottles to Mrs. Truckle, who filled each one carefully using Benjamin's old iron funnel. Busy, she said to Letta, never taking her eyes from the task. Letta nodded. Busy, she agreed. They both turned as the door into the shop opened. 1 minute, Letta said, putting down the bottle in her hand. She ran out to the shop only to find Rose standing there. Rose, Letta said, unable to hide her surprise. Rose was holding a bottle of water, a bottle big enough to be an allowance for 2 people. She pressed it into Letta's hands. For you, she said. For you. No, Letta said, trying to give it back to her. I do nothing. You helped Daniel. And before Letta could say another word, Rose was gone. Letta stood looking at the water. This was crazy. She couldn't take it. She had done nothing to deserve it. But there was something else bothering her. She hadn't liked the way that Rose had looked at her. It reminded Letta of the look Rose had had on her face when she knelt before the goddess. She turned to find Mrs. Truckle framed in the doorway behind her, a worried crown creasing her old face. Why she give water, she said, and Letta was back again in the classroom with the woman who always demanded an answer. Letta shook her head. Nothing, she said, nothing. Mrs. Truckle nodded to the bottle of water in Letta's hands. Water, not nothing. She say you helped Daniel? Letta paused. Now what could she say? Day they took him, she managed finally. Helped her day they took Daniel. Mrs. Truckle looked at her without speaking, and Letta knew she didn't believe her. After what seemed like a very long time, Mrs. Truckle reached out and took Letta's hand. Be careful, Letta, she said with a steel in her voice. Be careful. Afterward, when Mrs. Truckle was gone, Letta sat at her desk, lost in thought. The sound of the door opening startled her. She looked up. A man stood there. He was wearing a long black overcoat with a hood. The hood almost covered his face, wreathing it in shadow and making it impossible to see him properly. Letta opened her mouth to speak to him just as he removed the hood. The morning light hit off his curly black hair, and Letta gasped. Marlowe. He turned and saw her, a big smile spreading across his face. He looked so much better than the last time she'd seen him. Letta looked up at him. You came, she said. You sent for me. He smiled back at her. How did you know about the stone? Hugo, she said. He nodded. Of course. Maybe I should close the shop? She looked nervously toward the door. It might look suspicious, Marlowe said. The Gabbers are on full alert at the moment since Hugo's show. Hugo's gnarled old hand flashed through Letta's brain. What will happen to him, she said. Marlowe looked away from her. They banished him this morning. Letta felt the room sway. She clutched the counter behind her. We've been out all night looking for him, but we didn't find him. He's an old man. He wouldn't have survived long out there. Marlowe's voice seemed to be coming from within a long tunnel. They had banished him. She couldn't process it. He had been alive and well yesterday. Letta, what a lovely name. It's all right, Marlowe said, putting his arm around her shoulder. They can't hurt him anymore. Marlowe pressed a bottle of water into her hands, and she gratefully sipped from it, leaning her head on his shoulder. What happened, Letta? Marlowe's voice was gentle, but there was tension there, too. She could hear it and see it in the way he kept glancing at the door. She tried to marshal her thoughts. John Noah told me Benjamin was dead, but I don't believe him. It sounded bizarre now that she said it to someone else. Why would Noah lie? But Marlowe didn't look like he thought it was bizarre. He frowned and said, So you think he's alive? Letta nodded and told him about the note and her conversation with the scavenger. We need to find out what he knows, Marlowe said, and Letta's heart lifted at the use of the word we. She had begun to feel so alone, surrounded by things she couldn't figure out. It was good to have someone to discuss it with, though she wasn't sure about talking to the scavenger. I don't think he'll say any more, she said. Smith Fearfall is not the easiest man to talk to. Marlowe smiled a small secret smile. We have ways of talking to people like that, he said. Maybe I had better close the shop, Letta said. We can't risk a gaffer wandering in. Marlowe nodded. Letta walked to the door and was just about to slide the heavy bolt across when someone pushed it open. Letta stumbled under the pressure. When she looked up, John Noah was standing there, looking down at her. For a second, Letta couldn't quite take it in. She recognized John Noah and she saw the two Gabbers standing outside the door, but she couldn't put it all together. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. May I come in, wordsmith? Noah's voice brought her back to reality. What was she to do? She stood back, and he swept past her. Marlowe was still standing where she'd left him at the counter. Letta saw his eyes widen, then he bowed his head, staring at the floor. Noah looked at Marlowe, eyes narrowed. What your name, boy? For a second there was silence, and Letta could hear the beating of her own heart. Leo, Marlowe said without looking up. Name Leo. John Noah's eyes swept over him like a radar. Why you no work? Letta felt the blood drain from her face. Tin Town, Marlowe said, not looking at John Noah. Noah frowned. Tin Town, I see. Suddenly, Letta couldn't take it any more. She had to say something. She had to finish this. She turned to Marlowe and took his arm roughly. Go now, she said sternly. No food for you here. Need to talk to John Noah. Marlowe scurried out past her, the very vision of a shy peasant. Letta prayed the Gabbers didn't recognize him. She held her breath as he walked past the two guarding the door. John Noah laughed. Letta turned to him. You like your new power, Letta. I can see that. Letta glanced at the door. Marlowe was gone. She started to breathe normally again, but her legs were still shaking and her head felt light. Are you not going to invite me in? John Noah said, and Letta could see the amusement in his eyes. Of course, she stammered. Please. He followed her into the living room, and she gave him Benjamin's chair. Can I make you tea? She asked. He shook his head. I want to talk to you, Letta, he said. Yes? Letta answered, hoping he couldn't hear the shake in her voice. About Smith Fearfall. Letta felt the room tip. Fearfall. He knew. He knew she had been to Tin Town. You spoke to him about Benjamin, Noah said softly. Yes, Letta whispered. You went to Tin Town and questioned him. I didn't mean any harm, Letta said. I hoped he could tell me... Could tell you what? John Noah said in the same gentle voice. Could tell me more about Benjamin. Yes, Noah nodded. You wanted to know what Smith was doing there? Letta was afraid to answer now. The atmosphere in the room had become oppressive. Noah hardly moved and didn't raise his voice, but there was an air of menace about him. Well, let me tell you why he was there. Letta held her breath. I sent him to look for Benjamin. For a second, Letta forgot to be afraid. You sent him? She said, blush rushing to her face. Why you sent him? Noah sat back in his chair, and Letta felt his eyes sweep over her, examining her from head to toe. She shifted uncomfortably. Could he see through her? I was worried about your master. We were old friends, Benjamin and I. I knew him from before the melting. Benjamin served our cause well. Letta could see the old man was lost in thought, all the tension gone out of him. Benjamin wrote stirring articles on the web of the world, telling people about the cause, warning them that the end was near. Of course, they didn't take him seriously. A conspiracy theorist, that's what they called him. Even as the water was rising on all sides, they challenged our every word. He stopped talking, looked down at his hands, twirling his thumbs. She noticed how white the skin on his hands was and saw again the long nails. Then he looked up at her. I was worried about him. The desecrators have been busy as of late, and they have no respect for the likes of your master, so I sent Fearfall to track him down. You know the rest. Letta nodded. Guilt came in waves. Had she been so wrong about Fearfall, about the desecrators, about John Noah? In the future, come to me with your questions, child. I don't like people snooping round behind my back. He stood up. Even in old age, he was a forbidding figure. Letta thought he towered above her. I'm sorry he died, Letta, but he is dead. You should accept it and move on. Ark needs people like you. You are our wordsmith now. Don't get stuck in the past. Your place is in the future. When she looked up from the floor, he was gone, but his words hung in the room as real as the table beneath her fingers. She heard the door bang and sank to the floor, feeling the cold of the marble seeping into her bones. Talking to the girl had awoken old memories. Don't get stuck in the past, he had told her, and yet here he was revisiting it again. He remembered the end so distinctly, beat by beat, image by image. It had started with rain. 3 weeks of unrelenting rain. People had laughingly started to talk about building an ark. He had been way ahead of them. He had built Ark from nothing and with nothing. The Green Warriors had inputted all the available data and come up with the ideal place to be when the end came. They knew, as others did not, that it had to be a place that could sustain them all when technology had been taken from them. They had built a new city, incorporating some of the old buildings, inventing new ones. Most importantly, they had designed and made filters embedded with natural water channels extracted from the green plants that could remove salt from seawater. Water was the key to life, and John Noah and the warriors held that key. From the safety of Ark, he had watched the end unfold. The rain, 3 weeks of the heaviest rain the world had ever seen. In the cities, the force of the water in the drains propelled the manhole covers from their moorings. He remembered pictures of a car with a manhole cover embedded in the windshield. There was water everywhere, but still, the politicians reassured people with soothing words, fraudulent, empty words. And then, as the rain still pounded the earth, the storms came, storms that gathered in the ocean like wild horses. Huge storms with waves 100 feet high, lashing the coast mercilessly. The earth shuddered under the attack. The electricity had to be cut for fear of fires. The world was plunged into a terrifying darkness, and still nature roared. Gales of 400 miles an hour had no respect for that fine line between sea and coast. The wind chased the water in, over the man-made barriers, through the streets, over the buildings, drowning everything in its wake. Millions of people died, millions of animals, millions of birds, all lost. He remembered one of the last speeches given by John Hardy, the head of the United Nations. I have nothing left to give you, he said, tears streaming down his face. Nothing but my words. Noah wiped away his own tears and stared into the middle distance. Soon there would be no more words, none at all.